Morning, Mr. Carter.
Morning, sir.
Now, let me explain the arrangements. You're talking to an audience which largely contains participants, core participants. To your left, there are lawyers. The back, there would be representatives of the press. Beyond this room, however, both in this building and more particularly on YouTube and live stream, there will be other people who will be interested to hear what you have to say. So that's who you are speaking to. In a moment or two, Mary will invite you to take the oath, and then Ms. Fraser-Butlin will ask you the questions.
Yes, sir.
Mary.
Please state your full name.
Keith William Carter.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly and sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Nothing but the truth.
One other thing which I omitted to mention a moment ago is that somewhere around 10 to 5 to 11, we should take a break so that anyone who wishes to join the nation in the observance of the 2-minute silence at 11 will have the opportunity to do so. So the break today will be at a different time from the usual for those reasons.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Carter, you are an employment expert and have considerable experience in giving expert evidence in the courts about employment and labour market issues. Is that right?
Correct.
And that evidence is to assist courts in a number of ways, but frequently in a personal injury claim, that would assist them to assess the loss of earnings that are arising from the person's injuries caused by the negligence of another party.
That's correct, but it's a bit wider than personal injury. It can be bullying at work. It can be abuse at childhood.
In terms of your personal injury, clinical negligence type of work, what percentage of your work is for claimants and what percentage is for defendants, roughly?
We tend to be instructed by those who want our services, not whether it's claimant or defendant. Usually the way that it runs, it's the claimant leads the case, so it comes first. So I would say it's about 60 claimant, 40 defendant.
And to give some context to your evidence, you wrote to Sir Brian and the inquiry after Sir Robert Francis produced his report and provided some of your views on the issues relating to calculating losses in relation to the labour market. And you were then asked to provide a formal witness statement, which is what we also have.
Yes.
And just for the transcript, the letter has a URN of KCAR 40100. In your witness statement, you say that when one is assessing loss of earnings, it's important not to freeze an individual's career at a particular point in time. Can you explain for us what you mean by that?
Well, if somebody's had an accident and they're 12, or maybe, no, let's take 16, coming up for their GCSEs, and so maybe it's a subtle brain injury, so their GCSEs are lower than they could expect, then one has to look at an alternative career profile for them or career trajectory. Or an alternative may be somebody who's, say, a firefighter who has a career but then is injured, so can't continue in a manual career and has to look at retraining, opportunities that would be available to them with altered physical capabilities, but taking into consideration their skills, experience and qualifications at the time.
And so what you're seeking to do is to look at the arc of the career and not just say this is where the losses flow from.
That's right, and that's the freezing of the career. If you took a one person at one time and said, well, that's your life, that's not the way employment works. There is an arc going up. It falls off slightly after 60, but one expects to go up to a career, although sometimes there's something that happens that it flatlines. But whatever it is, you shouldn't just freeze it at that time. You should look at the circle of what's going on in terms of the employment, the job they have, and the market in which they work.
I want to start by asking you questions about the context of somebody who is injured, not those who are affected, and we'll come to affected people towards the end of your evidence, but initially, in relation to a person who's been injured, in a, if I can call it a standard claim, in a normal court claim, it's right, isn't it, that the career path that has in fact been followed after the injury is valued financially, and a hypothetical scenario is determined in relation to what the career path would have been and the earnings would have been but for the injury, and the claim is for the difference between what actually happened and what would have happened if the injury hasn't taken place.
Correct. I would probably, in a report for the court, provide, we would call it a but-for, but it may not be one but-for scenario. It may be it could have been this, it could have been this, but for the court I give two different but-for career scenarios. And then we look at but-with scenarios. So what their altered career opportunities might be, whether there's a delay before they go into work through training, but to give an alternative but-with scenarios. So that then the court can see but-for as a set of career earnings, and then but-with a set of career earnings, so they can see the difference.
And within those two types of scenario, how is the earnings curve over time usually dealt with?
That's why they ask me to get involved in the cases. There isn't one answer. Quite often, one relies on what used to be called the New Earnings Surveys, now called ASHE. But that's a very broad-based salary survey. And one has to match that with specific data related to an individual's career. Because ASHE, it takes subcategories. You may ask me some questions about this, but they're so generic, so wide, that you can't pinpoint a particular person's career. So if I was preparing a report for the court, I would use ASHE as background, and then I might use a specific, so if it's a teacher, it's teaching pay scale. If it's a lawyer, I might go to the Law Society. But I use a number of indicators to help provide a guide to the arc of earnings that could but-for have been achieved.
So I want to come back in a moment to ASHE and exactly what it is, because that won't be familiar to many people who are listening. So we will unpack that in a moment.
I understand.
But in terms of...
I think perhaps now would be a good time. It's
Of course.
spelt ASHE, isn't it? And it stands for the Annual Survey of Hours and Earnings.
That's correct, sir. It used to be called the New Earnings Survey, but in 2000 they rebranded and brought in new categories. But it's called, some people refer to it as ASHE, some people as ASH.
I want to go through that data just in a moment, if I may, sir.
Oh, yes, I was just wanted to explain the letters.
Of course. When you're talking about having specific information about the individual who's been injured, when you prepare your expert report, what information do you generally have, what do you need to have about the particular person in front of you?
I'd almost always asked to interview them, but that's sometimes not possible. So assuming a desk-based report, then one would want the medical evidence. One would want their past employment history, so effectively a CV, if one can have one. And their earning capacity in the past is looked at. One also needs to look at their qualifications, which would be on their CV. So running through it would be their qualifications, their age, and their employment.
And if you were addressing expert evidence in relation to someone who's never worked pre-injury, so for example, someone who's injured as a child, again, what specific pieces of information would you want to have about them and their family? Well,
it depends when the accident occurred. So if one takes below school leaving age, but they're in high school, then one can look at the high school they attended and look at the outcome of that high school. If they haven't, then one looks at their family. And in fact, we have at KCA, we have a family questionnaire to help, almost a family employment family tree. So we could look at the qualifications of the family and the work achievements of the family. Because there's a number of studies that the children actually do listen to their parents. They may not say they do, but eventually they filter into employment that mum and dad may have encouraged them.
And within that, would it also be useful to have the information about what siblings have done who are have not been injured.
Absolutely. When I say family, the family tree we have, it is a family tree. So we go further, which is aunties and uncles, grandmothers, grandfathers. So we can actually see not only the employment, but where the influences might have been.
We spoke just a moment ago about the ASHE data set. First of all, could we turn to RLIT 301859? This is not the ASHE data set, but it's part of a book called Facts and Figures, which is used by lawyers when they are determining or calculating and considering personal injury litigation. And there is a series of introductory notes followed by tables, ASHE tables, or a subset of the ASHE tables. And if we can just work through some of the paragraphs, I'll read it out so that those who are listening are aware of what we're looking at, and then I'll ask you a question, Mr. Carter. Yeah. So if we just pick it up in paragraph 2 of the introductory notes, ASHE, the annual survey of hours and earnings, provides information about the levels, distribution and makeup of earnings and hours of paid work for employees. The data are collected and published by the Office for National Statistics. ASHE replaced the New Earnings Survey, the NES, in 2004. ASHE is based upon a 1% sample of employees taken from HM Revenue and Customs PAYE, pay-as-you-earn records. ASHE does not cover the self-employed nor employees not paid in the reference period. ASHE is collected in April of each year and is published as a first release the following October, November, December. A second and final release is published in October, November, December a year later and includes any revisions to the estimates which may be required. The revisions are usually small. The tables reproduced here relate to a sample restricted to full-time employees on adult rates of pay whose pay was not affected by absence with the exception of being furloughed. And then the estimates are disaggregated, so split up by sex and by a 4-digit occupational classification. And if we pick up at paragraph 6, the earnings information relates to weekly and annual gross pay before tax, national insurance or other deductions and excludes payments in kind. Earnings are reported for full-time employees who are defined as those who work more than 30 paid hours per week. 2 measures of typical earnings are reported, the mean and the median. The median is ONS's preferred measure of average earnings, as it's less affected by the relatively small number of very high earners, which skews the distribution of earnings. The median provides a better indication of typical earnings than does the mean. And then again, earnings are reported by occupational codes. And then if we turn on to page 4 of the document, we see one of the tables extracted, and it's gross pay for full-time male employees on adult rates, including impacts of furlough. There are tables, Mr. Carter, aren't there, of female employees and all employees, so you don't have the distinction between male and female earnings.
This is true. In facts and figures, it actually doesn't have all, which it should have. But
the
in ASHE
data
figure has males and females and all, correct.
And then we see categories of job, and there are many pages of this document. We see gross weekly pay with a median and a mean given, and then gross annual pay with a median and a mean given. Can you explain for us, first of all, when you would use ASHE figures in your reports?
It tends to be the first source of information one uses. So one has a general view of the occupational area that you're looking at. Perhaps if I could just go through them a little bit more. On the page you've got there, you've got weekly earnings, then you've got annual earnings. Now, the weekly earnings, because the salary survey is taken in a week in April, and this is the financial year 21. So it's taken as a snapshot of 21. So if you're actually looking at the weekly earnings, you may be in the pay banding because there hasn't been an annual increase for 2020. So you have to bear in mind that Ash is actually 18 months, nearly 2 years behind if you use the weekly earnings. However, the annual earnings are the same. They will be taken from the tax year that goes through 2021, although they're published in the 21-22 figures. But then on the page we've got here, what they've done, the questionnaire goes to the employer. It's an enormous questionnaire. Fortunately, they have to complete it. And they show the weekly earnings, you can see. They give an indication, the number of jobs in thousands that they estimate would be included in the sample size. And then they give the median and the mean. And then they look at a similar exercise, but the employer will have filled in the earnings, the annual earnings. And what they've given here from individuals that have provided, or the employers related to the individuals, they've annualised them and they've given them in gross figures. So if you took as an example elected officer representative, it's got nothing because the survey sample, I'm not sure if you want me to go through this, it's a bit, well, if you like, they work on a 20% deviation, plus or minus. If it's got an X there, they're worried about the figures may not be representative to be a national statistic. So the figures here are agreed as a national statistic. So that particular one, they were worried about the survey number, the survey sample, so it's not included in a...
And in layman's terms, that means they didn't think there were enough people in the sample to be confident that this was an accurate representation of the earnings. Is that right? That's
correct, but you may come to me, Ash is thousands of pages, and you can request it, because they do keep the material, the information, but because it's below the 20%, it might only be 21%, so it's only 1% below what's in here. They call it, for some reason, I don't know why, but they call it safe figures. So you can actually get, where you've got crosses, to take that as an example, you can actually apply for that and get it. And then you can decide whether, in my case, I would decide whether to use it, because the error factor may only be 25%, or whether it's 55%, in which case I wouldn't use it.
In terms of some specifics as we look at this table, first of all, the question of whether you use the male and female tables or whether you use the all tables, what would your concerns be about using different tables for men and women as opposed to using the all tables?
Well, there was a judgment many years ago, I think it was Wass and Walsh, that suggested that it would be inappropriate to use female earnings, as that would perpetuate a gender bias, and things are changing. You could say you could take the earnings for males, because females' earnings aren't going to go down. But I always, in my report, I always use all figures rather than male or female.
And in terms of using weekly or annual pay figures, which do you tend to use in your reports?
I use the annual figures, and the reason being is that the annual figures will include additional payments. So the annual figures include bonus payments, productivity, overtime. Where the weekly payment is just, or can be, just a snapshot of a weekly pay. It may be a weekly pay where there isn't any overtime. If it's a construction worker, it may be through the winter, so there's no overtime. Whereas if you've got the annual pay, then you cover variations that might occur in a particular occupational area.
And in terms of using the median or the mean, can you help us with which you consider most appropriate? We've obviously seen the notes, in fact, and figures that suggest the median is
yes, well,
more useful. But what are your views?
I disagree with Ash.
We'll come to the disagreements about Ash generally in just one moment. I just want to unpick the particulars of it.
I use the average, the mean average.
The mean average. And why is that your preferred method rather than the median?
Well, I actually should just rewind on that slightly. If I'm doing an equal pay exercise, I'm looking to match a particular field of employment against another field of employment.
Sorry,
then I
just
might
so
use
that
the
those
median.
listening understand what an equal pay claim is. It's a claim in the Employment Tribunal of generally women saying we haven't been paid at the same level as men. That's a very big simplification, but it's a female claim saying the men are paid more than us.
More than women. Yeah, sometimes it's men and men.
Indeed, but broadly.
But
So
mostly
in that
it is.
context.
In that context, absolutely right. So in that context, I want the median. I want a mid person to give me an idea of what is paid in a comparable, we're arguing, field of employment. When I'm doing personal injury, then I prefer the average because the ASH figures have already adjusted for the 20% variation. And you don't know whether the individual is going to be a high earner or a low earner. So I prefer, and I think it's a fairer assessment as to earnings to use the average.
You've said that you have concerns about using ASH data at all. Could you tell us what your concerns are?
Well, no, again, I just, in fact, I must mention ASH 5 times a day, every day of the week for the last 40 years. So I don't dismiss it. It's a very useful piece of information, but it does have flaws. The biggest one, it doesn't include self-employed. It only includes in full-time, it calls, over 30 hours. It doesn't include additional benefits outside of overtime and bonus. So it doesn't include the employer contribution to pension, for example. So while it's a useful starting point, it's when I'm preparing my report, and of course these are on an individual assessment basis, then I can use other data to bring into it. And then I might well have a summary table saying ASH, teaching pay scale, average of the above.
I think you've also flagged in your statement a concern that there's no distinction in seniority or not sufficient distinction in seniority in the ASH tables. Could you unpack that for us?
Yes, I mean, it's not on this particular table that we've got in front of us, but if you were looking at the electricians, you don't know whether it's an apprentice electrician or let's call it an improver. So just finish there, because it does break it down by age. Whether they're an electrician working with a local authority, whether they're an electrician working on Crossrail. I use Crossrail because it's very high earnings across all occupational areas. Whether it's a foreman, whether it's a senior foreman, it doesn't break down the career span. It just takes the average of all of them.
And you've also flagged, I think, in your statement that there's a particular issue at the moment because of the inclusion of periods of absence for furlough.
Well, this actually has mentioned that it does include furlough. But the problem with that, of course, is that furlough, we don't know the exact arrangements, if you assume it's 80% of pay. So the figures here, but it doesn't actually say which ones are affected by furlough. But the figures here may be adjusted down by 20% because the number of those in that category were on furlough. I flag it up in that sense. It's more, if one were looking to say, well, what did one earn in that year, then it's quite useful because it makes adjustment for furlough. So it assumes, yes, okay, you're on furlough, you've got 20% less. The problem would be if you framed it and said, okay, this is the earnings now, I'm going to use this as a multiplier for the rest of your life, then you're actually starting at the wrong point because you've got 20% off in some of these figures.
But that problem might be avoided if ASH figures were used, so this year's ASH figures were used this year, next year's were used the following year, and it was followed through according to the ASH figure.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's a blip of 3 years.
You mentioned that other benefits aren't included in ASH, like the employer's pension contributions. What else do you think are not included in ASH? The
private healthcare comes to mind. it depends what strata of employment. So if you're in the categories we've got here, which are high earning categories, there might be long-term incentive initiatives. Even in some other categories, if you work for the breweries, for example, there's quite often share options that can come in. The co-op has share options that can come in.
This is just a snippet of the ASH data. ASH also has centiles of earnings, so where people are put into the sort of 5th centile, 10th centile, etc., all the way through 50th, 75th centiles. And in some litigation, an individual is placed on a particular centile according to where they were either pre-injury or where they will be post-injury. What's your view of using centiles rather than means and medians?
Well, the percentile allows us to, in fact, in litigation, the percentiles aren't often used. They should be used more because you can be much more sophisticated in the presentation of a career profile. The problem with using ASH, and in fact there was evidence given in the inquiry for a woman who was a teacher, and she, her loss was the fact that she was a teacher, but she wanted to be a head teacher, or assistant head teacher and then a head teacher. So her future career had been affected. But if you took the average, then it includes all these, but below her, who were at the start of their career. She passed all that. So the problem with using the median and the mean here is that you've actually, you're pushing her salary down because it includes all the junior members of teaching staff up to her point, and it doesn't have the enhancements which you could do if you use the percentile. So you could take the average and then the 60th percentile, the 70th percentile.
So, for example, if someone was very early in their career, you might start them at the 5th centile and they would move up. But somebody who was much further on in their career, pre-injury, at the time of injury, they're much further on in their career, you might place them at a higher centile to represent the fact they've gone through all that junior stage. Is that what you're? Is that
you could do that. You'd have to introduce a ceiling somewhere, and because not everybody goes up to the upper decile. But there would be, in some cases, and this may be where you go back to the family and their education, where you place them on that percentile. So if somebody's 32 and a lawyer, to take the average, that may be unfair because then they may want to become an equity partner, a salaried partner. You remove that from the assessment as to their loss.
Sir Robert Francis recommended that in some cases a standardised figure should be used of median earnings plus 5% of the median, so median plus 5%, as a way of calculating an annual payment. This is a question you may not be able to help us with, but I've been asked to ask you, would using the 55th centile be a more straightforward, perhaps more appropriate figure than doing a percentage of a percentage?
You need. I'm moving from an employment expert to a statistician. But I think there's two things that may occur that you may be asking me. One is, do I raise it by 5% for annual increments, or do I raise it by 5% for career progression? And I would say, well, why 5%? Because we could go 5, 10, 50, 20%. I wouldn't freeze a career as a +5. It's a bit, we may come to the ASH figures where you've got discount factors. Then I think what you need to have is +4 factors. And having just a 1 +4 factor, I don't think is appropriate in all cases.
We will come to the discount factors in just a moment. But before we leave ASH, if ASHE isn't used, what other data sets can be used alongside or instead?
Well, it would go to the information that you have. So if we've got a teacher, we've got the teaching pay scale. You don't need ASH. Teaching pay scale is much better. If you've got a nurse, you've got the NHS pay scale, and you can do the same because there's gender for change. A nurse would be grade 4 or 5, would go up to grade 5 and 6. If you're a banker in the city, there's a city pay guide. For those of us who are employment experts who are looking to advise, there's lots of sources we can tap into to provide a good, fair guide as to a person's career trajectory and career earnings.
And what are the advantages and disadvantages of using that other data?
To use the other data, you need very specific information on the individual, so you know where to place them. The value of ASH is that it's an umbrella, and there will be some specific areas where there isn't. And barristers, for example, it's almost impossible to find how much barristers earn. I often ask them how much you earn. They're very reluctant to tell you, because they're self-employed. So there's certain areas that become difficult to profile. But our approach is to find as many cross-references as we can to make it a fair assessment. The reason why I first wrote to Sir Brian was that I just felt that using Sir Robert's view as just one indicator could, very possibly could, undervalue a lot of individuals.
And your approach would be to have ASHE, but then also have other material that would shift the figure from ASHE up or down according to the particular circumstances of the individual.
Correct. It may be possible to use other data and then match that with ASH if you want to talk the percentiles. So you could say, oh, look, a grade 6 nurse in old speak would be a sister, let's say, is in line with the upper 7 percentile of ASH. So it's a way of cross-checking salaries.
Once that annual figure has been, you've reached an annual figure for loss of earnings annually, if a lump sum is being calculated rather than an annual payment in the claim, then that is multiplied by an actuarially calculated number called a multiplier. And that number is for the number of years to pension age, reduced according to the risk of mortality in any event, and to take account of the fact that the money is being received immediately, whereas it would otherwise be received at some point in the future. Now, that actuarial calculation is in the book again, the big red book, and I want to just take you to how that actuarial figure is then adjusted in certain circumstances. If we could turn to RLIT 301857, please. We see here the heading contingencies other than mortality. So in other words, the actuarial tables that are generally used account for the fact that someone might die in any event during their working life. But this section of facts and figures deals with the other risks than mortality that need to be accounted for, that might give rise to someone not earning as much as one would expect. Is that a fair summary?
Yes. Yeah.
What I want to do is just read through some of the explanatory notes from the facts and figures so that those listening can hopefully follow what it is we're dealing with. If we could turn to page 4, please. Under the heading, paragraph 64, in this method, multipliers for loss of earnings obtained from the actuarial tables are multiplied by reduction factors to allow for the risk of periods of non-employment. They are determined according to disability and educational attainment. Apologies, sir, I've gone to the wrong page from where I wanted to start. Could we turn to page 8? Apologies. Page 8 of the document, paragraph 75. This should get us started a bit more clearly. A separate assessment is made for A, the value of earnings the claimant would have received if the injury had not been sustained, and B, the value of the claimant's earnings, if any, taking account of the injuries sustained. The risk of non-employment is significantly higher post-injury, where there's been an activity limiting impairment. The loss is arrived at by deducting B from A. In order to calculate the claimant's loss of earnings, had the injury not been suffered, the claimant's employment status and disability status need to be determined as at the date of the injury or the onset of symptoms resulting in a loss of earnings, giving rise to the claim, so that the correct reduction factor can be selected. And then it tells us which tables to use. Tables A and C should be used for claimants who are not disabled at the time of the accident, and tables B and D should be used for those with a pre-existing disability. In all these tables, the 3 left-hand columns are for those who were employed at the time of the accident, and the 3 right-hand columns are for those who were not. Why are employment status and disability status pre-injury relevant to the calculations? Why did they change someone's loss of earnings?
Oh, well, if you've got a disability, then it's more difficult. Start from the beginning. If you've got it, and we're talking all disabilities, if you've got a disability, there will be jobs that are no longer available to you. So your job search period is going to be longer. You've got to readjust. You're competing with those who are fully fit. And the biggest difficulty often for those with not catastrophic injuries is that they're no longer flexible. So they can be a driver, but they can't unload goods. But there's 10 other people who can drive and unload goods. So the job search period, in fact, the Disability Commission did some work on, and I think it said that a disabled person has to apply for 7 more jobs than an able-bodied person. So when you factor all that in, if you've got a disability, you're disadvantaged on the labour market, and what that means is it takes you longer to get a job. If you're a less flexible employee, if there's reductions being made, you're at risk of losing a job.
And before we take our break, in terms of the relevance of being in work versus not being in work at particular times, what impact does that have? Why is that a relevant feature?
Well, if you're in work, then it may well be the case that you can take sick pay. The employer is supposed to make reasonable adjustments, so you've got some degree of employment protection. If you're out of work, then you're on the labour market trying to apply against everybody who's fully fit.
And before we carry on and look at these reduction factors, Sir, I'm conscious of the time, and I wonder if we should take our break at this.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now and come back, shall we, at 10 past 11. So break now until 10 past 11.
Sir, could you give the witness the usual warning? Oh, sorry, okay.
He's an expert.
Oh, indeed, apologies.